Hello lovely people, I'm K3N and welcome to my channel. This is part 2 in my series of wonky log cabins, and in this video I'm going to show you how I join the blocks together. So I've already joined a few because this is going to be a journal cover. This is 4 blocks that I've joined just using strips. So I did a strip to join 2 and a strip to join 2 and then a long strip through the middle there, which gives a kind of window effect. And then on the back I do a ladder stitch, so I'll show you that in a minute. But it makes a fairly sturdy little piece when it's joined like that. So for the other side of my journal, I've got another 2 pairs already joined. So I need to join those along there. And then I want to make a sort of wraparound side, so I've got 2 individual blocks to join together. So I need to just join those 2 there. And then I think I'm going to put something plain in between, but anyway, that comes later. So first of all, I'll show you how to join 2 individual blocks. So these 2, I think because I want to show you there's a few different ways. I think I'm going to join them with a strip with a seam each side, like I did here. So this is the joining strip here in the middle. So I'll show you how I did that. So for that, I choose, because I'm joining light to light, I'm going to use a light strip. If you were joining dark to dark, then obviously I would, get a dark strip so it keeps in with the pattern. But I'm doing light to light. So let's turn it back light to light so we do it properly. So you see I'm making this triangle shape. So I've got this bit of light coloured cloth that's quite fine cotton, so I know I can make a nice seam out of it, and it is 1 inch wide. I didn't rotary cut it or anything, I just measured 1 inch and tore it. But the reason for that is because I'm going to take a 1/4 inch seam each side ish, which takes off 1/2 inch, and then the 1/2 inch that's left will cover the 2 1/4 inches. That makes sense. So I'm going to cut it to the length of the block for starters, which is 3 inches, but I'm just going to use the block as a guide. Be careful not to cut my block. And I'm going to get my piecing cotton, and I'm going to, now if you want to measure 1/4 inch, after many years of doing normal quilting, I can pretty much see 1/4 inch, but if you want to measure and draw a line, then you go for it. And if you want to pin it, ditto, you go for it. So I'm just going to come through from the back and do a little back stitch. I'm stab stitching here because it is quite thick. As soon as I can get away with not stab stitching I will, because I'm not a great fan of it. I much prefer the rhythm of in and out. So I think now I'm past that seam. So I'm just doing a little running stitch, and it is quite thick because of all the layers, but it's doable. And absolutely you could do this on a sewing machine if you wanted to. Just making sure it stays matched up somewhat as I go along. Do the other side. And once I get to the other side, I'm going to have to stab stitch because it's a bit thick there. And I'm going to get a knot, which is not helpful. There we go. And then I'm going to just do a couple of back stitches on the spot. And I'm going to cut my thread. So I've sewn my 1 seam. So now I'm going to finger press this away from me against the stitching line. Again, if you want to iron it, you go for it. Like that. And then I'd always lay things out and double check, otherwise I end up sewing the wrong thing to the wrong thing. So I want to sew that to there next. So I'm going to flip that over onto there, like that. And I'm going to turn it round because I much prefer to sew from the the joining fabric side rather than the back of the block. And just make sure it lines up somewhat, the block to the block. Do you see? That block's slightly bigger, but I'm just going somewhere in the middle. It'll fit, and the raw edges line up. And again, if you want to put a pin in it. Now here, if you haven't been very accurate with your 1/4 inch, what you're aiming for is that your seam line is about halfway that visible strip, so that when you flip it over in a minute, the piece that isn't in the seam is wide enough to cover the seam. Do you see what I mean? So this needs to be a seam and a piece to cover the seam. So you need to be sewing somewhere up the middle. And I always go up the middle but a little bit towards the edge because the curve takes something. I'm getting finicky again. Just sew somewhere in the middle and it'll be fine. Stop being finicky. So I'm just coming through from the back and doing a back stitch. And again I'm having to stab stitch because it's quite thick. Cloth stretches. If you're working with wood or metal or something like that, you have less margin of error. So now I can get away with it, I think. So I'm somewhere, do you see I'm somewhere up the middle of what's visible in that little strip of cloth. Whoopsie. See, it doesn't pay to yank at it if that happens, because it rebels. Treat it gently. Nearly there. These little blocks take no time at all to join together. The piecing of them, I think the piecing video, which is part 1 of this series, took an hour to make a block. Right, so take a back stitch again, but this time I'm going to leave my thread attached. I'll take a back stitch just to make sure that seam is locked, because now I'm going to open it up and you see it's joined, and that just becomes almost a strip, you know, to match the other strips. And if I show you on the back, do you see how it now butts up together somewhat nicely? So just to stop that being flippy floppy, what I do now is I come up and I'm going to ladder stitch those two sides together. So my thread's coming from there, I'm going to come up through the back. You can see that, and I'm about 1/8 of an inch in from this edge. And now, just holding it together like that, I'm going to jump across there and take a little forward stitch, again about 1/8 of an inch in from that edge, like that. And you don't want to pull it super tight, but you want it to be snug, just so they sit up nicely together. And I'm going to jump back and take a little stitch. And I'm not going right through with these stitches. There's plenty of bulk there. You'd probably struggle to go right the way through, but I've got my finger behind just to check. So I'm just working my way along, just pulling them snug enough just to hold those two edges together. And this is obviously going to be covered, so I'm not worried that it looks somewhat functional, let's say. If you wanted to make a proper quilt this way, you absolutely could, but then I would probably, or I certainly would, put another piece of cloth over the back of it, and then maybe do some more sort of quilting type stitches through all the layers to hold the layers together. So I'm just doing, you know, they're quite big stitches, but they're doing a job. And I can feel there where I've stitched now, it's really quite firm, because those two edges are kind of holding each other up. Let's get to the other end. And then I'll show you another way of joining, which, you know, I kind of mix and match usually, to mimic the different ways of piecing in the block. If you haven't watched part 1, piecing the block, maybe that's a good idea to do that first, and maybe I should have said that at the beginning. Okay, so now I've come to the end. I need to take one more jump. But what I'm going to do is turn it round and then do my jump back, and now my needle's going back that way into the cloth. And then just make sure and certain that I'm happy with the tension of it. And then there I will take my couple of little back stitches just to anchor it. And I might just bury my tail a little bit as well. You could do the, you know, the loop, pull up a loop and pull your needle through and all that, but that's good enough. So there, do you see now it's holding together? So that's how it looks on the front. So that's one way of joining them. Let's just get the layout sorted, so that one's joined. So I've got these two. You need to look as well. Well, I need to look as well. Sometimes I don't like if these two were the same cloth, I wouldn't want them together. You know, it's up to you. It's just me. And so those two would then be the other side of my journal, and then this piece will make the wrap. Yeah, I think I'll go with that. So now I need to join these two longer pieces together. If you were making a bigger quilt, what I would do is I would join them in pairs, and then I'd join them in fours probably, and then I might make the fours into a 4 of 4, so that would be 16s. Do you see what I mean? If you make long rows, then you've got great big long joining strips joining the rows together, and I think it looks much better if the joining strips are sort of, you know, in shorter bits. It's just an aside. So to join these two, I think what I'm going to do is do it patchy. So I think I'm going to join this one side with this piece, and what I might do is do a seam onto there, and then come across and just stitch it on like that raw edge, or possibly the other way. No, actually I'm going to do it there because there's already some raw edges. Excuse me changing my mind halfway. Like that. So I'm going to seam it onto there, and then come across and have a raw edge showing. And I'm going to come right across this piece here with that, like that. Because then I think the other side, I've got this nice bit of, now you see that's the same as that, I can't have that. Go back to plan A. We're going to do that over there, and then this side, so I'm going to make sure that comes, you know, quite a way across. And then this side, I think I'm going to sew this on. I might tear it again down the other side as well. So it's a much narrower strip. So what's that, a good 1/2 inch, maybe 5/8 of an inch. And then I'm just going to stitch it on there and there, just to really to hide the join. So you can do it that way as well. So you can do, you know, a combination. And I think it's more interesting to do a combination. So if I'm going to seam this onto here, I'm going to start from there. I'm not going to cut it yet until I'm sure where I want to end it. Or am I? Yeah, I am. See, this is a video about me changing my mind. I'm just going to cut it. It doesn't really matter. I mean, if you only had a short strip and you did it there, like that, then you can have this strip coming over here. Because it's so scrappy, you know, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't. It's actually even nice because it just makes it more wonky. The more wonky, the better, in my view. Just sew it on and stop wittering about it. So I'm just going to do it with the somewhat 1/4 inch seam, and I probably will have to trim some off this strip in a minute, but I'll do that in a minute. So again, a little back stitch. That's a bit thick, so I'm going to do the stab stitching. Right, now I'm into just the straight flat strip and no seam, so I can do it like this. Oops. So I'm just going to go all the way to the end. I'm not going to turn that end under. I'm just going to leave that a raw edge. It's going to get covered up in a minute by the other strip. It's the radiator making a strange sound. And again. Don't know why it's doing that. Okay, so I'm through to the edge, the end, and I'm going to do, you guessed it, a back stitch, and I'm going to cut that off. Now I need to decide how wide I want this to be. If I leave it as wide as that, I'm butting them up underneath, It's going to cover all that lovely fluffiness. The other thing you could do, of course, as well, is turn that under and whip stitch that down onto there like that if you wanted to. But I'm going to stick with my raw edge idea, but I need to probably trim off a quarter about where I folded. That's what you could do actually. You could fold where you want it to be trimmed to. And I'm going to endeavour to rip it, which is not always easy with a little strip like that, but I'm going to give it a go, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to hold tightly to my stitching so I don't pull it off as I go. I could, of course, have done that in advance, and maybe that would have been smart, but there we go. That's all right. And I'm going to fray it a bit more nicely, not too much. There we go. I'm going to make sure that they match up somewhat at the two edges. Excuse me. And then making sure they're butted up, I am going to then pin that. So I'm really making sure they're pushed up together. And I'm pinning, hopefully not through to my tablecloth. There we go. I think I'm all right. Now, because I'm going to be top stitching, you know, stitching that's visible, I've already thought ahead a little bit about decorative stitching that I'm going to do on it, and I've chosen this sort of pinky, tea-dyed pinky colour, and I've chosen this. I liked the little bits of green, so I've chosen this dark green. Whoops, come here as well to go for the decorative. So what am I going to do there? I think I'm going to go with the green. So now I just need to make sure that it's a bit awkward because that's a bit flappy, but it doesn't matter as long as this bit stays together. In fact, you know what, I'm going to pin that as well, which I'm going to have to overlap it slightly, but just to keep it. Do you see what I'm doing? Just pinning it there like that so it just stays and it doesn't pull apart here. So now all you need to do is make sure that you go through the block underneath, you know. So I'm overlapped there by a good 1/4 inch. So as long as I am somewhere within that space, so I'm going to come up somewhere halfway that. So I'm about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the joining strip, like that. And then you could do a running stitch, or you could do a cross stitch, or you could do, I think I'm going to do that, some stitches, stick stitches. It's like ladder stitch really. It is, you know, exactly the same movement as I'm doing on the back to join. Get the pin out, hold it firmly. I'm going to have to stab stitch there because that's in the seam again. So here I'm joining and pardon me, and it's the decorative stitching as well. It's really thinking about what you want to achieve, and I'm so sorry, and thinking about how you might get there. That's maybe not the conventional way, but maybe a more interesting way. That's that bit of pocket lining that's got poly in it. I'll be glad to get past that. See, it wants to come apart at the middle. That pin didn't go right through. That's my problem. That's my problem right there. Make sure that pin's right through. There we go. That's better. Where am I? Where am I? I'm down there. So yeah, it's ladder stitch basically. So you're just jumping backwards, and in principle you're doing 2 parallel rows of running stitch at the same time, and in between you're jumping backwards and forwards. And this green seems quite standy-outy at the moment, but once I've put lots more of it on there, I'm sure it'll be fine. At least I hope so. Nearly to that last pin. it doesn't actually matter if you don't go all the way through, as long as you get, you know, into some substance. Here I am going to go all the way through because I feel I need to. That's really, it's alright. I'm in that corner. And do this last one, I think, like this. There we go. I'm going to go through to the back. I'm going to leave that in there because I might well use that now for the next part. So I get that pin out. Now I'm going to get this little bit of fluffiness and decide. I think I'm going to sacrifice this piece because it's so narrow. I think I'm just going to sew that over it, like that. And what am I going to do there? Am I going to do the reverse of what I've done here? I think I am. So I'm going to turn it round. I'm going to leave that there for a minute. I have 2 needles on the go at once. What could possibly go wrong? I'm going to turn it round, and I'm basically going to do the reverse of what I just did, in that I'm going to seam it to this side, flip it over, and then stitch it down to that side. Here comes Fred. He's getting on for his tea time, so he'll be cross. And I'm going to overlap here by 1/2 inch or so. I'm just going to look how that looks if I do that, and I think that's fine. So those stitches will be under there, but I think that's fine. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to cut that to size. And get my piecing needle. Right, so this is a bit awkward, but not really, you know, there are worse things. So again, I'm just going to hold that on there like that. And I'm going to, actually, before I do that, I'm going to just check how far down I want the seam to be to make sure I've got enough. Yes, I'm okay. It's just checking little things like that in advance, especially if you've got a fragile little bit of cloth like this that you insist on using, even though it's probably not the right thing to be using in a structural way. Back stitch. Here he comes. There might be a Fred coming by in a minute. There's a load of stuff there, and he can't find a root. No, he's gone on the floor. And Stella's asleep behind me, so I hope he doesn't start wrestling with her and waking her up. So I'm nearly to the end. So, and I need to stitch, well, you know, needs a big word. I want to stitch to the end of this little joining strip so that it turns. Don't attack me because I'm ignoring you, you little monkey. He's jumping up at my back, and he doesn't scratch, but he kind of dabs you, you know. So yeah, so I want to stitch to the edge so that when I flip it over, it'll lay. I'm just going to do one more back stitch for luck. Cut that off and turn it round. So my green thread is, where is my green thread? Yes, my green thread's in the middle. So I just want to, Fred, that's naughty, scratching my chair. I just said you didn't scratch and then you come and scratch. So I just want to flip that over. And like I said, I'm losing that bit of cloth under there, but I don't mind. I don't mind. Oh dear. Oh, I pulled a pin out and my thread came with it. And I'm just going to pin that, make sure I'm into the block underneath this time, so it stays put. I'm slightly hampered by the ring light for the pinning. I think I can stitch almost without looking, but for pinning I need to see. And I've got you right down low. There we go. Stop complaining, Catherine, and just get on with it. They don't want to know about your camera and ring light woes. Right, so I've got my thread there. So I think I'm going to just this time come up from the back and just in the spirit of making it up as I go along, I'm going to do some 1 or 2 stitches there, maybe 2 stitches, maybe 1 stitch. Whoops, come on, 3 come. Pin out, it's not helping anymore. Pins are helpful until they're not. There we go. And I'm just going to do running stitch along there, just for a change. I could have carried on doing the stick stitches and then they'd have been in a sort of staggered line, which might have been nice. So I'm just going through nearly the very edge of that, and I'm probably dancing with disaster because, like I said, it's very worn, that bit of cloth. But by the time it's stitched onto something else and it's had more stitching on it and so forth, I don't think it'll go anywhere. I hope not anyway. I probably wouldn't do it if it was going to be a bed quilt or a lap quilt or something. Probably would have chosen something sturdier. Okay, so just make sure I'm still lined up underneath. There we go. So there we go, so that's my block joined. And like I said, they look a bit odd just on their own, but once there's more of it, I go through to the back. I don't know what I'm going to do around the edges of my journal yet, whether I'm going to do a binding or sew a bit of lace round or just blanket stitch it or whatever. So just to leave myself options, I'm going to finish it off on the back so that I haven't got things on the front that might not be nice. So now that's joined. I'll just show you. That's joined and it's a bit flippy floppy. So then the next thing to do, but I don't need to show you that again I'm sure, is to do the ladder stitching along there and then come back and do it along there. And then that piece will be as sturdy as that piece. So I'm going to go away and do some decorative stitching on them. And the next time you'll see this will be in part 1 of the Wonky Log Cabin Journal, whatever I'm going to call it, probably that. Okay, so the other way of joining is to just put them right sides together and sew a seam. Now, as I said, or I hope I said, another word, but anyway, I'll say it again. If you're planning on joining this way, there's 2 things you have to bear in mind. One thing is when you decide on the size of your foundation cloth, you need to factor in a seam allowance. So that can be 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch or some weird millimetre measurement if that's what you use. So that's the first thing. So if you want your blocks to finish at 6 inches, for example, and you're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, your foundation squares need to start off at 7 inches because you'll have 1/2 an inch there and 1/2 an inch there. Hope that's clear. The second thing is if you're going to make a seam here where the blocks meet, you have to really pay attention to what fabrics you use on this edge, as well as having the thinnest possible foundation cloth you can, because you're going to join here at least 2 layers to 2 layers. You're going to end up with 4 layers, and where the seams cross here on the edge, there you're going to have, well, that's a folded, but it's silk, so there you'd have at least 2 layers, the piece and the seam, 3, 4 layers joining 4 layers, so you'll potentially have 8 layers there. So that's super important to bear in mind. So then all you then do is you just lay them out, make sure they're how you want them, put them right sides together. Now these 2 blocks are not exactly the same size. Slapdash, but I'm just going to make them fit. So I'm just going to see if I can match the corners and then give a tug and they'll lay. Then that's what I'll do. I'll just pin them into submission. If it was too much, then I might have to trim one down or something. So I'm going to do a 1/2 inch seam. Let me see. It doesn't really matter as long as it's enough of a seam to hold them together and that you're consistent throughout so that, you know, they all end up the same size. Yeah, well, I'm just going to do a 1/2 inch seam. Why not? So match the corners, do the pinning with the little pinnies. If you want to draw a seam line, you know, measure and draw, then you can. There's no points or anything to match inside, it's just a question of matching the 2 edges. And already just from me tugging at it, it's now laying pretty much matchy. I've just got some normal cotton piecing thread, and I'm just going to take somewhere in the region of 1/2 inch. Now here I can already feel that because I'm in that, you know, where the blocks were coming in from this way, even though they're silk, it's quite thick. So you might have to do some stab stitching here and there, you know, through and back in 2 movements. And then that pin can go. Like, I still have to stab stitch. Once you get into where it's, you know, just one long log, you should be able to just stitch normally. Whoops. And I would probably do the 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or looking back stitch. So I'll go back slightly, just, you know, a little tiny bit, and then come forward. And then I'll take a normal running stitch, and then I'll do back slightly and forward. So I'll just do that all the way along, alternating a normal running stitch and a looking back stitch. So just while I go along here, I will say that there is another way of doing it, because these 2 ways that I've shown you, these 2 ways that you have seen, both need, if you're going to make a quilt or, you know, a throw or something like that, neither of them are particularly pretty on the back because of the joining. So if you wanted to make something that needed to be pretty on the back, you would have to then, once they were all joined, what I would do is then baste them to a backing cloth of some kind, and then I would put some more stitching through, just, you know, to hold all the layers together. So some of us would call that quilting. It wouldn't have to be anything particularly complicated or anything, because you've got all your loveliness going on the front already. It would just be a means of holding the layers. So I would probably just do some straight lines through that way and some straight lines through that way, perhaps you know, even along the joins of the blocks or something like that. So just bear that in mind as well. There is another way of joining blocks as you go, called quilt as you go. There are many ways of doing quilt as you go, which involves sewing the fronts together and then the backs together in such a way that you do end up with a neat back. And I will show you that at one point, but that's a little bit more involved. So that probably will be, you know, a whole video all to itself. But I've done it this way and then put a piece of sheet on the back and then just stitched through by hand. You could also do that on a sewing machine. And, you know, it works fine and they go through the wash and so on. But these, what I'm showing you here, are much more, bearing in mind the construction of them and so on, with all the raw edges and everything, much more designed for making bags or journals or wall hangings or cushions or you know, everything like that would work with this, because in all those cases the back is hidden by the item that you make. So if you want to make a log cabin quilt using this method, there will at one point be a whole video, or probably a few videos, showing you that. But that's quite an undertaking, because in order to show you properly I will have to make a log cabin quilt, I think. But you can absolutely do it this way. So all that wittering has got me to the end of my seam. And I'm going to take an extra back stitch there and open it up. So now I'm joined. Now you see this here now wants to flip over. So that would need some stitching in it to hold it down. And what I'll often do is I'll join, if I was making a larger piece, I'll join 4 blocks together. So then if I had another pair of blocks here, I'd do exactly the same thing, you know, hoping that we'll gloss over that fact that they don't match. I'd put them here right sides together and stitch that seam, and then I might then go in while it's a unit that size and do some fancy stitching on it. And then things like that you can sort out just with a, you know, a bit of running stitch or cross stitching or whatever. So it will behave. We shall make it behave. And then meanwhile on the back, I kind of make it up as I go along, because sometimes if you've got a super thin bit of cloth here, like here I've got the silk and here it's thicker, when you look on the back you'll see that the seam naturally lays that way and it feels quite flat. So I will let it do that. Why not, you know? It's happy there, it feels nice, I'd leave it like that. If it was a bit bulkier on both sides, I might then open the seam up like this with my fingers, and I might even then take my thread that's still attached here and stitch that seam down to there. So I just come through from the back, and then I'd be careful not to go right through, but I'd just take some, you know, biggish running stitches along just to base that seam into place. But like I said, in this case I don't think I'll do that because it's happy laying that way. So just assess your seams as you go along and see what you think is the best solution. Especially if you're using all these different cloths, it won't be the same for every seam. To me, that again is one of the engaging parts of the process. Is it's not a set of instructions that you have to follow to the letter. It's looking at the work that you've made and considering it and deciding what's the best way to proceed with, you know, the number of tools that you have in your toolbox. So I hope that's okay for the joining. So I've shown you the butting up and, you know, with the strips, and I've shown you this way. As I've said several times now, bear in mind when you're making your blocks which way you think you're going to join, if the finish size is important to you. And I hope you have fun with it. Next week I'll probably show my little journal made with those tiny little blocks. Oh, let me just point out as well a little thing that occurred to me. When you make teeny tiny blocks like these that I can't get hold of, these are 3-inch blocks. They're quite sturdy and stiff, you can use that to your advantage if you want to do a journal cover or something like that, because, you know, or even a rice bag, they've got some substance to them. Because the strips are narrow, you know, there's lots of seams in there and folds and things, so it just makes for sturdy little. Do you see? They almost, if I just hold them in the middle, they're not really floppy. They sort of almost stand up on their own. I want to make it stand up now. No, don't be silly, Catherine. Right, the bigger blocks where the strips are wider, so there's less seams within an area, they're much softer. You see if I squidge that in my hand how soft that is. So that is more suited to a quilt or a throw, or, you know, something of that kind. You could also absolutely make a journal cover with that, and you'd have a soft journal cover, or you could back it with another cloth that sturdied it up, or you could put wadding in and then another cloth or whatever. But just bear in mind, if you make these teeny tiny blocks with these really narrow strips, they're going to be, you know, they're not stiff, but they've just got substance to them. So I hope that's okay, and I hope you have fun with log cabins, and I'll see you I'll see you before next week for other things, but in log cabin land I'll see you next week, and I'll show you the next stage in making my log cabin journal. So meanwhile, thank you for watching, and I look forward to you joining me soon for more cloth tales. Bye bye!